Hey, I'm Pat Keegan and welcome back to the DIY Home Build channel. In this two-part video series, or more like a mini-series I guess, I'm going to show you how to construct your own arch cutting jig so that you can mimic the arches, if you'd like, that we did in the built-in fireplace surround video. The reason I broke it into two pieces is because there's a little bit of theory that goes into creating a good arch and a little bit of math that you need to know if you're going to use the style of jig that I'm proposing. And I know there's, half a dozen ways you could cut, at least probably. You can cut arches into the upper rails of your bookcases or cabinets, but we're going to focus on one that is very clean and very efficient using a router. And I've seen it done using bandsaws. I think even Norm Abram built a jig where he rested a large piece of glued up wood for a table and he cut it into a round table. That's great, but a lot of us don't have bandsaws in our shops, and these videos are geared toward the novice or intermediate who might not. Another way you could do it is using a jigsaw. And I don't recommend that way because it's way too time consuming. If you can afford a jigsaw, you can probably afford a router. And I would just as soon get the router and use that with a special jig that we're going to show you how to make here. That's more preferred. If you insist on doing it freehand with a jigsaw, well, you could also build a jig for the jigsaw the same way you can with the router, but I just think the router's cleaner. And but if you try to do it freehand, you're going to spend an awful lot of time cleaning up your saw marks and getting the arch to look very smooth. It's just a really large waste of time unless you really like sanding or something like that. And even if you spend the time, it's very difficult to make it look smooth and continuous along the radius. So we're going to use the router, as I said, and in order to use the router with the jig that we're going to use, you have to know a little bit of mathematics, not a lot. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the formula, but it's really, there's a calculator online that can help you, and it's not that bad. Or if you like using Excel, the formula is really easy to do in Excel if you want to do that. But let's talk first about the different kinds of arches, maybe a couple different kinds of arches, and then the things that you really need to keep in mind to make a good aesthetically pleasing arch. And I know it seems weird, like maybe some people didn't give this some thought, but I've given it a number of thoughts, I guess, over the years. One of the things you can do with your arches is there's a couple different kinds. Like in generally, you can do an arch, and I'm just talking the straight arch, the simple, curved arch here. One of the ways you can draw your arch is like so, and you're going to see that these little tails are kind of sticking out. The good thing about this is it's much easier to do if you're doing pocket holes to do your joinery. You can get all the way down to the bottom here, very close to the bottom with a pocket hole, which is important to keep things, absolutely aligned straight. So this is one way you can do your arches. It's just perfectly fine. Another way to do the arch is you can actually span the distance between your rails, I mean your stiles rather, like so, and do it that way. Now, this is the way that the client preferred when we did our built-in fireplace surround. And as you can see, I've got basically a duplicate of the face frame here from that built-in fireplace surround project. It would be the rightmost base cabinet and bookcase. This would obviously be the bookcase face frame because it's got no rail on the bottom here for mounting purposes. But in any case, this is the type of the style of arch that we did. So what's the correct height that we should use? And by height of the arch, I really just mean from the edge of the board here that I use. And in my arches, I use upper base cabinet, upper bookcase rather, cabinet. I use a 1 by 8 typically size, which is about 7¼ inches wide. So what's the right height here, do you think? We could guess at it. We could say, oh, I don't know, 2 inches, 2.5, 3.5. But there's a good rule of thumb that at least that I follow. And again, rules of thumb are just rules of thumb. They're not the law. They're not hard and fast. Obviously, certain circumstances will dictate changing the rule of thumb or not following it exactly 100%. But in order to give you that rule of thumb, you kind of need to understand a little bit about what goes into the size of the arch itself in terms of the size of the face frame. Now, the last thing you would want to do is build this cabinet and then install it, and then let's say you built it with an arch like this. Let's say you just did a really tall arch because you like tall arches. And then you go to install your crown molding because you've got a gap between the top of the bookcase and the ceiling that you want to cover. And your crown molding, oh, bummer, eclipses the peak of the arch. That would look really bad, and I think your client would be pretty upset with you. So we definitely have to figure out a different size arch. There definitely are better sizes than others. You certainly don't want the crown molding to come in front of it. So that's the first thing that you have to think of, is what is going to be in front of the face frame or covering portions of the face frame. And in this case, I'll just tell you very briefly that the height of this crown molding is 2¼ inches. And that matters because, and by height, just so we're all clear and on the same page, I mean from the bottom edge of the crown molding to where that crown molding would touch the ceiling, which in our case is 2¼ inches, because I've got an inch gap of between the ceiling and the top of the bookcase, and a 2¼ inch high crown, and the height is determined again by when the crown is resting against the bookcase and the ceiling properly. That would mean then that I have 1¼ inch here of my face frame that's going to be covered by the crown molding. And why is that important? Well, to be able to determine the height of the crown molding, the height of the arch rather. See, you can't do two things at once very often very well. Let me move this down a little bit. In order to determine that, I need to know how much is covered. So if I know that 1¼ inch is covered and my board is 7¼ inches wide, I know that I'm going to have 6 inches left. So there will be 6 inches showing as defined by the lower edge of my crown. So if I draw the crown out like this, I can see, in fact, that from the bottom edge of the crown to the bottom edge of the board is 6 inches. And you can see that right next to the crosshair or in the bottom right of your screen. Okay, so why is that important again? Well, it leads to the second thing that you kind of want to look at, which for me is the rule of thumb I spoke of, and that is the width of my stiles. And in this case, they're 2½ inches. And if you watch the built-in fireplace surround videos, I probably tell you that at length, and probably more than once, that it's 2½ inches. Well, that would mean that I would probably want around 2½ inches showing at the peak of the arch. I want to be consistent. 2½ inches here, 2½ inches in this area, 2½ inches in this area. Well, if I know that this height is 6 inches and I want 2½ inches revealed, that means that I want 3½ inch not revealed, or as the height of my arch. So if I go ahead and I draw that arch all the way up to my 2½ inch line, I'm going to get, oops, I don't want to paint it. I'm going to get a 3½ inch tall arch. Now, that would make it look, reasonably aesthetically pleasing, because you've got the same amount of, face frame width all the way around, and it kind of makes it look nice. Now, you may not like it that nice. You may want to change this. You may want to go a little bit higher, another ½ inch. It's probably all going to be okay. Like I said, this is a rule of thumb, not a rule of law. So that's totally fine. So I'm halfway there. What I really need to cut, since I'm going to be using a router and a jig to do this, the router is essentially routed, attached to the end of a longer arm. And in order to do that, I kind of need to know what the radius of this arch is. Well, if you look here, now I'm just going to draw this very quickly, but if you look, you can kind of see, ugh, that's ugly. That's even really bad. You can kind of see that, that's pretty good right there, that this radius of this arch, or this length of this arch, kind of fits on this circle. And in fact, that's what the curve of the arch is. It's just an arc length along the circumference of a larger circle. And what I need to be able to calculate then is the radius. And in this case, just throwing a circle on, trying to line it up by eyeball, you can see that my radius here is 53 3/8 inches. It's down in this right-hand corner. Well, that's a pretty long arm, and if I had gone out to the store and I had bought a circle cutting jig like the kind that you can buy at, Rockler, this looks like the Rockler circle cutting jig. I mean, I can just tell looking at these jigs here that you can buy, or even some that you can make yourself, they're not even close to 53 inches, which is why if you want to use a router, you should definitely build your own jig. And so you're going to need to know how long of an arm you need, which is going to be slightly larger than the actual radius. But we can't be actually imprecise with this. We have to be very precise with the radius, because otherwise the router is going to either cut too far over here, or it's going to leave a little tail. It's not going to cut all the way to the exact end of the board, and that's why you need the exact radius. And so in order to get the exact radius, there's a formula that you follow. And before I give you the formula, because I know you're all dying to know what that is, you have to know that on any circle, a line that intersects 2 points of the circle that is not the diameter is just called a chord. So in this case, the height of our arch is this height here. What's the chord then? Well, the chord is simply the length of the board here that I'm going to be cutting this arch on, which is 35 inches. Now, if you cut a smaller arch and you want the tails on it, and you want a smaller arch like that, then the chord would just be from the end of the arc length to the other end of the arc length. So I know that's kind of a fancy word for line or segment, but it is what it is. That's the geometry of it. So we know the chord length, which is just this line here, is 35 inches, because that's the length of our board. And we know the height, which is 3.5 inches. So the formula is actually then very easy. The formula itself is not so easy, but good thing there are calculators online, or if you're like me, you put it into Excel. It's simply the chord length, which is 35 squared, plus 4 times the height squared, which is 3.5 squared, all divided by 8 times the height. Well, I could go do all that by math or calculation, but I'm too lazy, so I put it in Excel. And what did I say our arc length was? 3.5, our arch height rather. If I do that, then I know I need a radius of 45.5 inches. So I know that my jig has to be at least 4 feet long, because my router needs to be mounted to it. So in order for me to do this, I'm actually going to make an arm or a jig that's longer than 48 inches. I'm going to make one that's probably about 6 feet. Because one thing that you'll notice is, what happens if I want a shallower arch here? What happens if I want an arch that is, like so? Pretty shallow. Let's call it 1.5 inches. Well, if I go to the tool here now, and I say 1.5 inches here instead of 3.5, watch what happens to the radius. It gets much larger. I need a good, 9 or 10 foot board to make this radius. So it's important to know then the arch height. If I make the arch much bigger, let's say I make it 5.25 inches instead of 3.5. Well, then I only need a radius of 31 inches or 32 inches, which means my jig has to be about 36. So you can see that changing the height of the arch really dramatically impacts the size of the jig. And that's why we're going to make a jig that can accommodate a large number of radii up to a certain point. I would never do a shallow shallow curve like that usually, so I don't really need it. And if I did, I would probably make a one-time jig that I could just, reuse later or throw away. So as you can see, just to kind of recap, um, in order to build this jig, you need to be able to compute the radius. And in order to compute the radius, you need the height of the arch that you need and the length of the cord, or the length of the board in this particular situation. And in order to calculate that arch height, you need to know a couple things, like how much of your face frame is going to be taken up by the crown molding, and how wide generally your stiles are. And once you know those things, you can figure it all out and then build your jig. So that's what we're going to do in the next video. Now that you have the background information, you're armed to go in to be able to build your jig and to set your jig up to cut these arches. So stay tuned for the next video, and I hope you were able to get through the ugly math and geometry here. I know it's painful if you don't like math. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.